Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, the Assistant Defence Minister, Stuart Robert, international human rights lawyer and author, Geoffrey Robertson, the editor of the Spectator Australia, Rowan, and the Shadow Minister for Health, Catherine King. Please welcome our panel. And unfortunately, Gough Whitlam's biographer, Jenny Hocking, is unwell and she isn't able to join us tonight. We wish her well. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24, News Radio and Australia Plus, and you can join the Twitter conversation by using the Quanda hashtag. And if you've got a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. We asked our Facebook followers what we should discuss on Q&A tonight. You favoured whistleblowers, Whitlam refugees and something out of the box. Well, our first question tonight comes from Dennis Sparling.
The government is cancelling the passports of suspected terrorists. Is this the best way to handle terrorism? Why not let them go overseas and maybe be killed?
Stuart Robert.
Look, thanks for your question.
It has to be said, they did have this debate in Canada last week.
They did. Keeping in mind, we've cancelled 73 passports as of this week. There's about 60 Australians fighting overseas on behalf of ISIL or Daesh, another 100 supporting here. What we can't allow is for a whole group more of young men and indeed women going overseas, being radicalised, learning new skills and then coming back with those skills, indoctrinated and seeking to do us harm. If you look at the Afghanistan experience, 30 Australians went and fought with the Taliban, 6 were killed, 24 returned. Of those 24, 19 would later commit acts of terror and 8 are still in jail. So the contemporary history tells us it's far better to engage our communities, work to stop young men and women going overseas and stop them being harmed, killed and radicalised.
Stuart Robert, among the Australians who already slipped through the net is the so-called ginger jihadi, the 17-year-old Abdullah Elmir, who most of us have seen in that now notorious video. How would he have been handled if his passport had been taken?
Well, if he'd been taken, there would be no ability for him to go overseas. There would have been an opportunity for him and his community to be rallied around, for authorities to assist if need be, but more importantly, a loving family to connect with him. Right now, I think this young man is lost. He is in the hands of some of the most evil fighters the world has ever seen, who are not afraid to use young men and women as propaganda pieces, and I think it's a tragedy.
Were you at all disturbed that his family could not go and try and get him out of their clutches because they feared that they would be breaking Australian law if they did that?
I think there's a part of me that was a little relieved. If you try and go over and engage with these type of forces, it is highly likely you'll be engaged and killed. So if there are Australians considering, I want to go and engage with these forces and get my best mate back or get one of my family members back, can I encourage them to seek some assistance from the authorities? Going by yourself is extraordinarily dangerous.
Geoffrey Robertson.
Australia has more anti-terrorism laws than any other country in the world. We've had 62 terrorism laws since 9/11. We don't need more. What our laws don't have are two things. The first, they don't have independent oversight. We don't have impartial judges giving orders and directing and approving warrants. It's entirely done within the intelligence establishment. But secondly, and I think this is the important thing about the question, we do not have, because law can't solve the problem of terrorism, we have to turn to community service. We have to turn to anti-jihadi organisations, de-radicalisation programmes. And this seems what Australia doesn't have. In Britain, for example, when a passport is cancelled temporarily, the person can always go straight to a judge and see about the justice of the cancellation. That is important. And remember that most of the last few terrorist acts have been committed by desperate, if not deranged, young men who've had their passports cancelled.
You're talking about the two Canadians.
Yeah, and perhaps also the one in Victoria. But there is a de-radicalisation program that anyone who is passport is cancelled is immediately put on. It involves not only police, but the local imams, parents, social workers, psychologists, even a couple of returned jihadis are part of that program. And I think this is what Australia is lacking at the moment, a proper de-radicalisation program that plugs in to those who are identified as being vulnerable and in danger of being lured overseas.
Well, Geoffrey, we'll come back to that because there's a question that relates to that. But on the question that was asked, Rowan Dean, what do you say?
Well, I'd just like to pick up on what Geoffrey said. I'm delighted we have more anti-terrorism laws than any other country. Thank goodness for that, and let's get a few more. It's probably part of the reason why we have not had, or touch wood, have not seen what they've seen in Canada and Britain and elsewhere. The fact of the matter is, and I totally agree with Dennis, unfortunately Stuart's logic is correct, but I'm with Dennis. If they want to go overseas and get killed, great, get them out of Australia and don't let them back in. It's that simple. From my point of view.
It's not really that simple, though,
of course it's not, and as I said, Stuart's logic...
Hang on a sec. Yeah, because of what happened in Afghanistan.
Sure.
So if you let them go overseas, get trained, and then they come back, then that can be an even worse problem.
Exactly. And
so what I'm saying is not that simple.
Exactly, and that's why I said Stuart's logic is correct, that unfortunately we do have to keep them here and not let them go overseas because of the damage they could do to anybody overseas, but in particular our own forces. But it is crucial that the police and the authorities in Australia have the means at their disposal to counter this threat, and that means the appropriate metadata laws, which should be allowed. The police are begging for them to catch these characters. Geoffrey's right. If you can put them into a de-radicalisation program, fantastic. But the laws are what is needed. We have strong laws. We need to keep those laws to keep ourselves safe and our children safe.
Catherine King, the more anti-terrorism laws, the better.
Well, I think, frankly, that you have to try and have checks and balances, and this is not an easy area at all. It's not an area that, you know, frankly, Australia has engaged with very broadly, but we're having to right at the moment. And I think that's why it's been important to actually allow parliamentary scrutiny of the current bills that are before the Parliament. We're awaiting the government to say whether they'll accept the Senate's committee's recommendations, but I think it's actually really important that there's proper scrutiny on those laws. People have time to debate and discuss them because they do have significant implications. But I think Geoffrey's right. Right at the heart of this is how do we actually engage with communities, particularly young men, but not only young men, in those communities to make sure that they're not actually getting radicalised in the first place. And I think when you have some of the statements that have been made by some of our more extreme members of Parliament, it's really unhelpful. It actually puts all of us at risk when people are actually alienating these communities.
What sort of statements are you referring to?
Well, I think some of the statements I think that Senator Bernardi, who you've had on your program a few times before, has been making, I think they're unhelpful. I think Abbott's Team Australia, I think too, has not overwhelmingly been helpful in engaging some of the Muslim communities as well. I think that's potentially been seen as alienating those communities. So I think it's actually just really important that we work with those, particularly young men. There's nothing that's going to alienate a young man more than if he sees his mum or his sister abused on the street because of their religion. I think we actually have to be as inclusive as we possibly can, and that takes all of us.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question that actually goes to that issue. It's from Urshel Oskato.
Weapons are going to be useless against ISIS. Most people are still trying to ignore the fact that ideas and beliefs matter to terrorists. Trying to end the radical threat of ISIS by destroying the individuals involved will only fuel the extremists' fury. Targeting lives will not kill ideologies or belief systems. My question is, why aren't we seeking ways of dismantling ISIS without killing people?
Stuart, Robert, the first part of that question you may not have heard, weapons are going to be useless against ISIS.
Yes and no. Ideologies certainly last and they are enduring. 81 or fighters from 81 different nations have now joined ISIS in their global battle, so to speak. However, words themselves won't dismantle this group. Reason won't dismantle them. Sitting down and chatting with them won't dismantle them. Knocking out their combat power, destroying their capacity to reach further, that's going to stop them. Allowing the Iraqi military to apply their ground pressure and troops will allow them to re-engage their cities, and then they can establish greater reason, greater understanding in their cities. But if we do nothing, if we pull our fighter jets back right now, ISIS will run right over Iraq, it'll run over Syria, and it won't stop there.
Can I just go back to the question, Ursula? Are you suggesting that you think the problem should be solved in Australia?
Well, we haven't really tried targeting the belief systems yet, and what you're suggesting is that we use violence, but you haven't really backed up your claim because we have never actually targeted the belief systems before. So this could be a new outbreak. This could be something new.
Do you mean targeting the belief systems here in Australia?
Yeah, both here in Australia and overseas. I mean, it has, you know, outsprung from Australia.
Stuart, Robert, and it goes back to what Geoffrey Robertson was saying earlier, and we'll go back to the case of Abdullah Ilmir. At 17, he was allegedly groomed by effectively an ISIS recruiter on the internet. Isn't there some way that that process could be stopped?
Extraordinarily difficult. Most of the internet groomers, if we could use that term, won't be hosted in Australia. They'll be hosted from overseas, so no law will stop someone who is actually hosted overseas. But let's not forget, we are facing at the heart a sectarian violence between elements of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. Sunni and the Shia. That goes back to whether Ali or Abu Bakr was the rightful heir of Muhammad from 1,350 years ago. That's how far back this crisis goes at its core root. The idea that we would today think that ideology or reason might actually stop that, I think might be seen as a little fanciful.
Geoffrey Robertson.
We do need to target the belief systems. I think the question is quite right, and that's why we need a de-radicalisation program. We need to teach these. We need to find out what motivates, what is the lure. I mean, the latest view in Europe is that it's boredom that is important, but that seems to be based on the fact that most jihadis come from Belgium. Quite serious, but Matthias Cormann could lead the way to Australia. But
I'll pass on your apologies to him.
But we are teaching them. You know, a lot of these kids actually believe that if they suicide bomb, they go straight to paradise and have 72 virgins at their disposal. Well, that actually, we're teaching them, is a mistranslation. It's actually 72 raisins, which was the translation that is apparently the correct one. And, of course...
Like the Arab scholar.
So instead of going down and blowing themselves up, they go down to the supermarket...
Make a cake.
...and get their raisins. But that is the kind of education that needs to be introduced. But as for ISIS, ISIS didn't come out of nowhere. I don't go along entirely with Chomsky, who said last week that the US created ISIS, but it was a development from the fall, from the invasion of 2003. Fallujah, which was where it incubated, was at greatest risk. There were Mosul, it was the al-Maliki years where the Sunnis were devastatingly discriminated against. So there is at the basis of a sense of injustice that has to be understood and eventually dealt with, and hopefully al-Maliki's passing will help it.
OK, I'm just going to go back to Stuart, Robert.
We've got no alternative but to fight, because ISIS is a genocidal organisation.
Well, one of the alternatives you mentioned before about what you do in Australia is a de-radicalisation program. Just quickly hear Stuart, Robert, on that. Is that a concrete way in which to approach this issue in Australia?
Absolutely. The fact that we've cancelled 73 passports, that 60 Australians have gone overseas to fight, another 100 are supporting them. It's extraordinary that people that live in this country feel they need to go over and engage in such
But what's happened
violence.
to the kids whose passports have been cancelled? Are they still on the street fuming?
This is where the de-radicalisation programs, engagement with local communities, engagement with the local authorities, engagement with local sporting authorities is so fundamentally important.
Do you know how many people are working it?
I don't, actually. Good question for the Immigration Minister.
Yeah. Rowan Dean.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating because what we've seen in the last week is a lot of these, the guy with the axe and the ones in Canada and all the rest, these are Caucasian converts to Islam. These are recent converts to Islam who've latched on to Islam because they see it as, most of them are pretty disturbed individuals, and they've latched on to this radicalisation which is on the internet. It's called Sheikh Google, if you like, Sheikh Google. It's targeted deliberately by ISIS online at these kids. Many of them messed up. If it weren't for ISIS, they'd probably be going into death metal or some other crazy thing. They're attracted by the violence. They're attracted by the hatred of women that is in these videos. They're drawn to the idea that they can be all-powerful, and most of them are pretty pathetic nerds. Ursula's absolutely right that the belief system has to be attacked, but it has to be attacked at a local level in the schools by kids like you, saying to kids who are watching this stuff online, watching the beheadings, and saying this stuff is garbage, don't get involved in it.
If they are that pathetic, and Senator David Leyonhjelm made this point, he said he referred to them as simple dickheads, and made the argument that they don't really pose that huge a threat that we should change all our laws in order to deal with it.
What we need to do is, like any danger, isolate it, find them, and if metadata allows us to track these individuals faster, that's what we should be doing. Our anti-terrorism laws should all be about protecting the freedoms of those people who aren't involved in this sort of activity, but coming down very hard on those people who are tempted by it.
OK, I'm just going to quickly go back to Ursula, our questioner.
I don't think they're dickheads. I just think they're disadvantaged in their area. So they try to latch on to a certain thought or a certain ideology. And they have extremist leaders overseas or even in Australia who are influencing these young kids and empowering them to join these groups. So I don't think they're really dickheads. I just think they're disadvantaged in a way. And you're here sitting here calling them, you know.
They're certainly not dickheads. They are tuning in to a Salafist philosophy that is being promoted relentlessly by our great ally Saudi Arabia, for reasons that we need not go into. But there is a religious belief there that also has to be tackled.
OK, we're going to move on. You're watching Q&A. Just a reminder, one of our advertised panellists, Jenny Hocking, the biographer of the late Gough Whitlam, was taken ill and couldn't join the panel. We wish her a speedy recovery. Our next question comes from Louise Jakes.
In the wake of Gough Whitlam's death, and in a nation where disenchantment often eclipses passion, does the panel believe that we're ever likely to feel truly inspired by our leaders again? And what might they do to rally us now and in the future?
Catherine King.
Thanks. Look, I think the lovely thing about the commemoration of Gough has been it's engaged a whole new generation who possibly haven't understood just what his legacy has been to this nation. I'd actually forgotten, you know, that you couldn't vote when you were 18 years of age, that was something that Gough actually enacted, and a really important part of that. But actually the things that matter to us, I mean, you know, universal healthcare, free education, actually engaging with the Indigenous communities around land rights and what that means today. I hope that it has inspired a whole other new generation of young people, but also, I guess, reminded us as politicians that actually what he was talking about deeply matters. And I think certainly for me in my area of health, I feel reinvigorated by going back over those debates. I feel disappointed that we're still having the same fight over Medicare that we feel like we had 40 years ago. You know, surely, you know, at last it's time to actually embrace a universal health insurance scheme from both sides of politics without trying to dismantle it constantly. But I think it has reinvigorated the political debate a bit, and I hope a lot of people do feel that.
Do you see any future Gough Whitlams in your ranks now? Because when it comes to inspiring politicians, I think a lot of the younger people out there might say they don't see too many.
I think we've got to be careful a little bit about that as well. I think that to some extent the sort of, you know, television notion about an inspiring politician, you know, I love West Wing with a great passion, but I don't know if we're going to see you know, President Bartlett in our time.
But what about a Gough Whitlam? Because you did see one in your time.
I also think that we are starting to see that. You know, I'll obviously say, you know, through the Labor Party, the sorts of things that we're trying to do in terms of health and education, where we want to build, we want to bring Australia back to, you know, what actually do we care about as a nation? Who are we as a people? And we should be really proud of the things that we have done and just how much we've actually embraced change and how brave we were there. And I really do hope that we start to engage in that political debate. And
when you say how brave we were, it seems to be the past tense.
Look, I think that's right, but I think there's actually also that real challenge for all of us. It isn't just about politicians. That was about the nation joining together to actually enact change, and it was, it's time for change. And I think that we're starting to slowly get back to some of that.
Okay.
I start to feel that.
All right. Well, Rowan Dean, front page of your magazine, Spectator, this week, has a big Gough Whitlam picture being whitewashed.
Whitewash Whitlam. I think you've got a copy of it there, Tony. I know we're not allowed to advertise on the ABC, which is a shame. Yes, there was... Louise is absolutely right. It's critical to be inspired by politicians. Gough was inspiring. He inspired a lot of people. Catherine, one of them. Kevin Rudd, one of them. Probably not as successfully as he inspired Catherine. But the point about being inspired by politicians is you're inspired by ideas. And the problem, and to answer your question, Tony, with obviously no one who saw Gough Whitlam's passing cannot be touched by a great Australian figure who has died aged 98. Fantastic. He holds a huge part in our history. But there was a lot of mythologising, including on the ABC, talking about the sort of Gough Whitlam that Louise is referring to, almost like a Nelson Mandela character that changed the entire Australian story. This is Paul Keating's line that there was before Whitlam and there was after Whitlam, and our whole nation changed. Now, young people like Louise, they've no reason to not believe this story, except that it's not true. And what changed Australia was the 60s and thousands of young people of all different political persuasions, some being inspired by Gough, some being inspired by other politicians, but the point was Australia changed. It wasn't Gough Whitlam that changed. Australia changed, courtesy of the 60s and attitudes and a lot of creative people and a lot of intelligent people. And the mythologising that somehow Gough was a messiah figure that led us out of the wilderness of torpor of the 50s and 60s is untrue.
Geoffrey Robertson.
Rowan, you weren't alive in the 60s.
You flatter me.
And if you had been, you'd probably have gone to jail. The 60s were the most boring period in Australia, not elsewhere in the world. The 60s, Australia didn't change. Censorship was utterly repressive. You couldn't read Lady Chatterley, you couldn't read the trial of Lady Chatterley. Portnoy's complaints publishers were prosecuted. We didn't recognise China. China we did not recognise because we thought America might not like it. We fawned on America. We did anything they wanted even before they asked. Divorce was almost impossible. You had to prove a matrimonial crime against your partner. I could go on. But Gough Whitlam dragged Australia into the 60s in 1972.
OK. Go to the question that was asked, Geoffrey. Here's a young person looking for inspiration in today's politicians and wondering why they're not seeing it.
Well, Gough didn't look at focus groups. He didn't deal with opinion polls, and it was a different time. It was time. I think he was our John F. Kennedy without the sex scandals. And I do think that it's worth remembering, and this is perhaps an answer to your question, is one remarkable thing about Gough Whitlam, the person. He was entirely uncorruptible. He had not a whiff of scandal attaching to him. He lived a good life, no associations with New South Wales property developers, no nepotism, no desire to make large sums of money. And at the end of the day, I think that's a point that's been overlooked both by his hagiographers and by his detractors, that he was simply, as a politician, he was a good man who gave his life to do what he thought, and was largely right, do what he thought was best for his country. And I don't think we can ask for more.
Stuart Robert.
I'm still trying to picture Geoffrey in a tie-dye shirt in the 60s. It's a little scary.
It's not so hard to imagine, surely.
Flowers in his hair, or that might have been a Sandy Thompson.
You were aged 2.
I was.
Perhaps you weren't aware what he was doing for you.
In some cases, thankfully, no. In other cases, it would have been great to meet him. Louise, ideas matter. They matter now, they mattered then, they'll matter tomorrow. And if we're going to be a great country that rises to our occasion and can be all that we want to be, we need to have a great battle of ideas. Will that generate great leaders? Only time will tell, but never shirk from the ideas. It's important we have them. The other thing I took away from Gough was when Gough died, or in fact when his wife died 2 years ago and he now passed away, it was the end of 70 years of marriage. Isn't that a fabulous thing? That there was a 70-year love affair between Gough and his beautiful wife, that they journeyed life together. I thought that was just fabulous. And that's one of the great things I'll take away from Gough's enduring life.
And what about the reforms that he enacted in the country?
Well, some things are part of our vernacular in terms of Medicare and other things that he brought in. Other things, of course, in 73, 74, taxes went up 30% and government expenditure 40%, and it took 5 prime ministers and 20 years to pay the debt off. There is good and bad in us all. There is greatness and perhaps weakness in us all. Let's be gracious to Gough. I think he's a great historical figure. He was a great Prime Minister in many respects, despite his failings. And he had a wonderful love affair with his wife, and I think that's extraordinary.
OK, we've got another question reflecting on what happened at the end of the Whitlam era. It's from Anne Munoz.
There was a naked lunge for power in the ousting of the Whitlam government. Fraser could have waited until the election, but the Greens seem to have forgiven and made Fraser their hero.
Catherine King, that is quite surprising, isn't it, that Malcolm Fraser is probably the hardest man that ever led the Liberal Party in some respects, ends up sort of proto-Green in later life. But let's go back to the dismissal. That's, was it a naked lunge for power?
I think that certainly history shows that even the Fraser government was damaged by the way in which they actually came to power, and I think that in hindsight it was a great time of constitutional challenge for Australia, and one I think that both sides of politics learnt from. We both agreed never to block supply, much to some people's disappointment in the last budget, I have to say. But certainly was a pretty torrid time in Australia history, and I don't.
You're not suggesting there was any talk about blocking supply in the last budget, just being facetious.
I was being facetious, yes, as always. But, look, certainly in terms of the Constitution, in essence, I think that it was a pretty terrible thing to have happen in terms of our constitutional history, and I think, hopefully, both sides agree to that now. I mean, we will never see such a thing happen again, nor should we ever in this country.
Sadly, Jenny Hocking is not here to talk about this, but the second volume of her biography of Gough Whitlam, released only 2 years ago, had information that had remained secret until then, which is that Sir John Kerr, the Governor-General, was secretly relying on advice from the High Court Judge Anthony Mason. He had other secret meetings, as it turns out, with the Chief Justice, Garfield Barwick. In terms of naked lunge for power, do you think that constitutional issue reflected on the High Court?
I think it was an extraordinary revelation, frankly, that second volume of Jenny's book, and it is a shame that she's not here to actually talk about how she got to that information. But I think it was, again, an extraordinary time, the like of which hopefully we will never, ever see again.
Rowan Dean.
Well, it's interesting because supply was blocked in the Victorian government by Labor on a couple of occasions earlier, which saw the dismissal of Conservatives. So it wasn't the first time it happened in Australian history. I'm astonished by Geoffrey Robertson's starry-eyed view of China in the 50s. Under Mao Zedong, China was one of the worst abusers of human rights, millions of people killed, and that is why the Australian people took so long to recognise China. I'll also point out...
That's quite a neat segue from the dismissal, I might
add. The dismissal, I just had to get that in. I also just wanted to get in that it was Menzies who recognised Japan, which at the time was far more important than recognising China. By the time Gough Whitlam recognised China, that was important. He did it, as did Nixon, so it wasn't a question of us appeasing America. But more importantly, just quickly, if I can just answer the question about the dismissal, a few weeks after the dismissal, Gough Whitlam was turned down in the biggest landslide, lost in the biggest landslide in Australian history, and 2 years later, when Gough Whitlam stood again for power, it was the second biggest landslide against him in Australian history. The Australian people who lived through the Whitlam era, and yes, Geoffrey, I did live during the 60s, those who lived through the Whitlam era kicked Gough Whitlam out twice because of the damage he did to our economy. because you can have great ideas, but you shouldn't judge people on their intentions. He had wonderful intentions, great man, great ideas, but the outcomes, he was incapable of delivering on those ideas, which is precisely what happened to Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and Labor refused to learn from the lessons of the Whitlam legacy.
I think that's a pretty long bow, Rowan, for a start, but and one you've made frequently. I think to say that, you know, Gough didn't implement, I mean, here we have today, you know, there is absolutely no way we would have a universal health insurance scheme that is Medicare if Medibank hadn't been introduced.
I know, it's one of his legacies.
He stared down some of his own caucus members to get Medibank through. The fact that we value so much in this country, and so many people, you know, in this room have had access to higher education because of Gough Whitlam, to say that he didn't implement those ideas, I mean, it was an extraordinary period
in 1966, half of the people in Australian universities were paid for by the government. Kevin Rudd said that you could not get to university unless you paid your way. That is untrue. In 1966, half the people at Australian universities, 7 of those universities, by the way, were built by the Menzies government. There's a lot of myth-making around Gough Whitlam. I'd rather the truth were told rather than the myth-making.
Well, I think, again, I think you have to focus on the legacy. And I know, you know, a lot of people have talked this week about, you know, there should be a monument to Gough of some sort. Well, the reality is that we're all Gough's monument. The fact that we're here in this democracy... Well, bizarrely... Bizarrely, the speeches, which I thought were extraordinary during the Parliament, was that a lot on the other side defined themselves and their political engagement as why they joined, because they were against everything Gough stood for. I mean, how sad is that, frankly? I think
Catherine,
that's
just to pick up the point about
sure.
the economic chaos that was happening at the end of... I mean, we have the loans affair, an attempt to get a middleman called Tirith Kemlani to come up with $5 billion out of thin air from a bunch of Iraqis. I mean, this was pretty strange stuff, the loans affair. I mean, most governments would not get away with that these days, would they?
No,
I mean,
look,
so it's not surprising they didn't, in a sense.
No, and I think Rowan's right in the sense that you can't whitewash the time, but I think, as I was saying, that I think the monument that is Gough is all of us. It's about what is Australia today, what have we got that's left over from that legacy and that we actually value and continue to have. And I think they're the things that, you know, when you talk about Gough, they're the things that I really remember and focus on. It was 3 years in government, but a very long time in Australia's history where we've actually reformed the country.
OK, Stuart, Robert, you said you didn't regard yourself as being in any way part of Gough Whitlam's legacy. What do you say to the question about the dismissal as being a naked lunge for power by Malcolm Fraser?
I think the dismissal has been the one area of Australian politics that the entrails have been poured over ad nauseum. I studied at university. I'm sure all of us did. In fact, I think we should have a hypothetical on ABC about it, Geoffrey.
Really?
But can I just say that when you studied it at university, you would not have known, because John Kerr's secret notes about this were only made public 2 years ago. You wouldn't have known that Anthony Mason, High Court judge, was secretly advising Kerr behind the scenes, for example.
No, when I studied in the 80s, a lot of that wasn't available. The internet didn't exist. Studying was out of books, heaven forbid. But it's certainly...
I'm just thinking, when you studied in the 80s, university was free as well.
Well, I went... Keeping in mind that it was actually a Labor Prime Minister who actually brought back in payment for university. So when I studied in the 80s, university wasn't free because the costs were boarding. But I actually went to military academy, so I'm a product of the Defence Force Academy and RMC Duntroon. So I got paid to go, but suffered enormously with small amount of sleep and lots of marching. But it's one of those rare events in Australian politics.
Did you initiate anyone?
Not at all. Not at all.
Did you, unless you're volunteering, run any initiation ceremony?
I didn't, but it's never too late to start, my friend.
No,
And can I say to Rowan, you speak of Victoria as an issue of blocking supply. I'm from Queensland, where the Labor Party in 1922...
You don't have to apologise.
The Labor Party was so upset with the upper house, they abolished it. It's the only unicameral house in Australia where there's only one house, because that was Labor's response to blocking in the upper house. But it's an extraordinary event. Was it a naked grab for power? I think we'll be talking about it for decades to come. It's certainly an extraordinary part of our history by an extraordinary man called Gough.
Let's move along, because we have drifted a little off the subject earlier. Our next question comes from Franco Veronese.
It appears that Labour now is also adopting the policy of the stopping the boat the hard way. How can Australia
all right, go ahead.
justify its legal position?
So you're saying it appears that Labor is now intent on stopping the boats?
That's what I read in the paper.
Yeah, well, just find out from Catherine King whether that is so.
Sure. Well, I had a look at, and this is in reference to some reports in the media today about some comments Richard Marles made. I had a look at those comments, and Labor's position has absolutely not changed on this.
Richard Marles' position changed somewhat, though.
I don't think that's certainly I read what he had to say, and that's certainly not how I read it at all. We do have concerns about boat turnbacks. They've been widely canvassed, both in terms of the way in which Indonesia has reacted very strongly against those and how it views its sovereignty in relation to those. But equally, we think they're incredibly dangerous. They're dangerous for the personnel engaged, which Stuart is obviously there seeking to make sure that they are safe, and they're dangerous for asylum seekers. Our policy hasn't changed on this, and certainly I didn't read that into what Richard said. I understand others have, but that's certainly not how I read it at all.
Stuart, Robert, I'll bring you in quickly.
Can't comment on the Labor Party, and I'll leave that to Catherine to make some comments on it. It's a vexed issue, and I know Q&A has spent a lot of time over many years dealing with asylum seekers. Yes, our government has turned back...
Not as many years as the government has.
Noted. Our government's turned back 12 boats as part of Operation Sovereign Borders. No one has been harmed or died during that process. None of my military personnel have been injured or harmed in that process.
How do we know?
And the boats...
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know exactly about my military personnel.
It's happening in secret.
And I know exactly what my military personnel do on the high seas. And of course, the boats aren't coming, so people aren't drowning.
Geoffrey Robertson.
Look, I think we've got to get this in proportion. There are 1.8 million children, as I speak, who are refugees. 70 a minute are refugees. We've got to work out how to clothe them and feed them and keep them safe. It is a terrible problem in the world, and in Australia it is literally a drop in the ocean. And all I would say, I think, is that we've got to stop talking about refugees as illegals. They're not dangerous criminals. They're people who risk their life in order to come here and work. And we've got to sometimes remember, I'm an expatriate, but I'm not an expatriate, and I can actually remember the second verse of the Australian national anthem. For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. Of course we haven't. We've got Border Patrol. And Border Force. And it is costing us a fortune. I heard $5 billion suggested as the cost of all those, of border control, of all those incredibly expensive private security agents on Manus Island. But at least we've got to think of that and stop this idea, which began with the Hawke government, which was the first one to put children behind barbed wires at Woomera, that we can deter the boats by punishing those seeking refuge.
Well, Geoffrey, you'll be happy that there are 45% less kids.
I would go back to Malcolm Fraser at the time of at the end of Vietnam, who set up a very different and very sensible basis involving Malaysia, involving Indonesia, dealing with them there through UNHCR and bringing them in.
Right, Geoffrey, I'm just going to, we've got to move on, so I want to hear from Rowan Dean on this subject. How did you read Richard Marles' comments on Sky?
Well, hardly surprising, because Labor told us all through the 6 years of Rudd and Gillard that it was impossible to stop the boats. Kevin Rudd deliberately opened our borders. We had a policy that worked, that, as Geoffrey says, was a Keating-Howard policy. It worked. Rudd and Gillard said, no, we're going to do it our way. It was a disaster. People died. Children died. People drowned at sea. The coalition said they would stop the boats. They've stopped the boats. The problem's over for the time being. Yes, refugees are an international problem. Absolutely a huge problem. But just letting anybody in on boats leads to deaths. It doesn't solve the refugee problem. And well done to the coalition for doing what they said they would do.
OK, we'll move along. We've got a few issues to cover coming up. Kate Fitzsimons has a question for us.
Is it justified that the Australia aid. They have asked Australian aid to go to West Africa to help combat the Ebola virus. In light of what has happened in America, where a doctor came back with the virus doing that same work, and is there an element of great risk to those aid workers in West Africa, not only to the aid workers, but to the general Australian public, if somebody comes back with the virus like we saw happening in New York last week?
Catherine King.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kate, and it is actually a really important international issue, and I know this is a very frightening issue when you see the footage, when you see the numbers about what is actually happening in West Africa. But what we do know is that we can't bury our head in the sand about it. It's, you know, it's often the reaction that you want to have when you see something that is, you know, this enormous. We've had 10,000 cases, 5,000 deaths. We've got the United Nations, a resolution which Australia has signed up to. We've got the US ambassador to the UN saying that it's all very well for countries to sign up to a UN resolution, but you actually have to engage and do something. As an international community, if we don't act to shut this down, it is a greater risk to Australia. It will end up in our region, it will end up on our shores if we don't shut this down in West Africa. The Centre for Disease Control has estimated there'll be 1.4 million cases by January, but if we act now, if we engage with the international community, the UK, the US, Japan, other European countries, Cuba, are all sending medical personnel. We've got aid agencies, Medicine Sans Frontières.
Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely.
3 weeks have gone by. Cuba has sent 165 doctors.
That's right.
Britain and USA and Sierra Leone have asked us. Not a movement. And it is a shame. As Bono said last night, although he said it on Channel 9, so I don't suppose there were many people listening. But we should actually feel disgraced that we have not been able to... Tony Abbott isn't able to pick up the telephone to Downing Street. If you're listening, Tony, I've got the number. And talk to Mr Cameron, talk to Justine Greening, who's running the UK, and say we've got hundreds of potential volunteer doctors, the Army reservists who were so good in the tsunami and so forth. We'll send them so long as you can guarantee that if any of them, unfortunately, does get Ebola, they'll go to the Royal Fleet. It's not a problem at all. Right there. It's not a problem. It would be a scandal.
Geoffrey, I think we better hear why it's a problem.
Well, fine words, Geoffrey, but they're wrong. Let's not rush to failure. Let's not rush to failure.
We are rushing to failure. We are absolutely rushing to failure.
Or indeed Australian medical personnel into harm's way if I can't do two things. Get you into medical care if you get in trouble and bring you home. How would you like me if I sent your sons and daughters into an area like West Africa, but I said to you, I can't guarantee health care if you get the virus and I can't bring you home? Until we can solve those two, and there's a lot of discussions going on, and we've asked those questions of Her Majesty's Loyal Government, and the answer so far has not been affirmative. All of that negotiation's going on, but please don't rush to failure.
Well, you've certainly not been rushing to anything.
Yes,
That's been
we have.
Actually, you have
yes,
not
we
been.
Have.
You have not been.
Extraordinarily.
You have been so slow to act on this. So slow to act on it.
So,
it is
Catherine,
disgraceful.
How do I bring people back
It is inconceivable that the British
government... You shouldn't bring people back who catch the virus. A 30-hour flight would not be in their best medical interest, and no one has suggested that they should.
So OK, I'm just going to stop the... Just hold on for 1 second, because we have one of the... Excuse me.
I will name it. It's the British...
Hold on, we have a questioner in the audience, and I'm going to go to them.
Stuart, I was wondering, why can you send troops over to ISIS but not doctors to Ebola victims?
Thanks for the question. The answer is quite simple. If any of my troops are injured, I know exactly which hospital they're going to, what care they're going to, and I can get them back. I can answer those two fundamental questions.
And I'll answer the question for you on Ebola. It's 6.5 hours. I've flown it often from Sierra Leone to London, where the best Ebola treatment in the world at the Royal Free Hospital would be available. And if you asked at a top level and got a reply no, it would be a scandal in Britain that an Australian doctor working with a UK team would not be admitted for treatment. It is simply inconceivable, and you've got to do that. There will be a
Geoffrey, can we just let Stuart Rowan answer this? Let's
what are you doing?
Well, hang on. Let's just find out. Are we actually, the Australian government, that is, are you making these kind of calls, and are you preparing for the possibility, at least, of sending military and military-trained medical staff into West Africa?
Yes, we are making those calls with respect to finding, if we were to send any team of medical professionals, which hospital facility they could use and how we would evacuate them.
In fact, are you saying that you want to do that?
I'm not making any in terms of we want to go or not. I'm simply
really
making the point.
Australians down. There are
we
40
are having
of them there
those
already.
conversations
They're real heroes.
with our partner nations, cognizant that some of our nations actually don't allow by law an infected patient to cross their borders. It's a difficult, complicated process. We're working with our friends and partners. We can't push them. We'll work constructively with them. Don't rush to failure.
So briefly, is there any kind of timescale on this? Do you know when you'll get an answer as to whether you've got evacuation procedures in place to be able to send these troops and medical staff to Africa?
Diplomatic negotiations never have a time frame. We never put time frames on our friends and partners in terms of our assistance for their help. We'll work through it constructively.
Well, the UN's put a time frame. The UN said on the 1st of October we had 60 days to shut this virus down in West Africa. We are now 2 weeks down the track. I don't want us to get as a country to January with 1.4 million cases and say, oh, why didn't we do something? We absolutely have to do something, and this government has been very, very slow.
But if you were in government, if you were in government, would you do it without having in place the proper evacuation procedures?
We would be absolutely working our guts out to make sure we did get those in place.
So you're doing the same as we would.
That is not what you've been doing.
You do the same as we would. That's what you've said.
That is not what you've been doing.
Exactly the same as what we were doing.
Have you?
Thank you, Catherine.
Has the Prime Minister spoken to a minister in the British government? Has Mr Abbott spoken to David Cameron?
I'm not going to put words in the Prime Minister's mouth because I don't know what the Prime Minister
I mean, this is an
or
emergency.
the Health Minister have been talking, but I guarantee those conversations have been had at the highest level. And Catherine, thank you for saying you'd do exactly what we would do, ma'am.
The first time the Health Minister even got on a telephone conference with the Chief Medical Officers and the State Medical Officers was 10 days ago when it hit the media. 10 days ago. Now, that is not where you would want a health minister of this country to actually be when we are facing something like this.
OK, can I hear from Rowan Dean on this? Sorry, you've been sidelined in this rather fiery discussion.
No problem. It is the job of the Prime Minister of Australia to protect Australian lives first and foremost. That is his job. He's approaching it cautiously and carefully. Anything else is the height of irresponsibility. If he sends people over, we know some of them will die, some of them will be infected with Ebola, and some will come back here with Ebola. He's approaching it cautiously, carefully. If you like, he's giving the virus the benefit of the doubt, and so he should.
We're just going to quickly go back to our original questioner. Go ahead, if you have a question or comment.
I think it's the same old story with Australia, where they feel pressured into doing whatever America and the UK does. And I think it's the same thing that's happening here as well. And I know I've got a son who's a nursing student, and I wouldn't like to see him going over to West Africa.
Well, thank you very much.
Would anybody on the panel like to go over if they were in the medical profession?
OK, we will take that as a comment. There's quite an interesting place in which to leave it, but let's move on. We've got two questions now on the same subject. The first comes from Vache Kara Rumian.
Last week at the National Press Club in Canberra, Geoffrey Robertson referred to the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, as foolish for denying the Armenian Genocide. Isn't it time that Australia join our international allies, including France, Canada and Germany, in recognising this historic fact in light of Turkey's ongoing threats against Australia?
And because this question has two competitive sides, we could probably say that, let's have a second question from Gunesh Gungo.
Hello. Well, at a time where Turkey has accepted more than 1.5 million refugees, spending almost $5 billion on them, where it has suffered terrorist acts such as the assassination of 3 off-duty soldiers on the streets by terrorists, where nations who refuse to send their own troops to Syria demand Turkey to risk their lives. Mr. Robertson, you are here in Australia to promote your book about events 100 years ago. Mr. Robertson, you have commenced your analysis of these events from April 24th. given the extensive military activity by Armenian nationalists and revolutionary groups, including the sacking of the city of Van, which was just 5 days before this date.
Now, Ganesh, you are rather elaborating on your original question. I think it must be said. We might just get you to go back to your original question and just complete it so that we can actually get an answer.
Thousands of Muslim subjects of Ottoman Empire. Have you considered what role those nationalist uprisings may have had in the relocation notice?
Geoffrey Robertson.
Yes, I've considered it very seriously at some 300 pages length. And you can buy my book. It's an inconvenient genocide, and it is inconvenient for Australia.
Well, that's an inconvenient advertisement, as a matter of fact. So why don't you just tell us what's in it?
I'm sorry. Well, I don't have it here to hold up. No. It is important historically to see it for what it is, to tell the truth, particularly because it has the connection with Australia. The Gallipoli landing was used as the cover for the initial act of genocide, which was rounding up the intelligentsia, the community leaders, the magazine editors and so forth, and they weren't seen again. But it was the cover for a mass deportation, a death march, which killed more than half the Armenian race, and it was an example of genocide, and we need to study it as well as the Holocaust to recognize the insignia and the dangers of the inflaming racial or religious passions to such an extent that a large part of a group is destroyed. But what I accept, of course, that Turkey today is in many ways very important, and that is why it is inconvenient for certain countries to recognize the truth about the genocide. In fact, when the New South Wales Parliament passed a genocide motion, recognition motion, the Turkish speaker threatened that they wouldn't be allowed at Gallipoli. And when the Australian government rather said, well, we don't recognise the genocide, all the Turkish papers said, Australia doesn't recognise Armenian genocide. Went on to say,
Geoffrey,
we don't take a position, which I think is the correct...
Because you've made that point. Now, the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, said it wasn't a genocide. We don't, at least that Australia does not recognise it.
She said two disparate things. She said Australia doesn't recognise it, and then went on to say the government doesn't take a position.
All right, the government doesn't take a position. Stuart, Robert.
Keeping in mind, I'm one of the defence ministers, not the foreign minister, so I'll bow to the foreign minister.
But you do have some responsibility for what happens on Anzac Day next year, the commemoration. And
I actually don't. Senator Ronaldson does. I just run the department. Senator Ronaldson gets to travel and do all the good things. I just make defence actually work.
Well, you have a certain amount of interest in it, let's put it that way.
Well, I do, but you're stretching the bow there a little as well, although I have been to both areas. Julie stated the position of the government. She stated it squarely and she stated it succinctly.
And why did she make that? She'd not read Geoffrey Robertson's book, evidently.
Well, evidently not. There's been a number of books written. Geoffrey's done a very good account, as he always does. There will be others. And like all battle of ideas, we should continue to pursue it.
OK, look, I don't think we've got that many experts on this subject on the panel, so we'll go to our final question. It's on a subject everyone can talk about. It's from Bob Partington.
My question's to Rowan Dean. Rowan, given that the ABC is possibly the largest media organisation in the country, how can we ensure that the ABC fulfils its obligation to be balanced?
Thank you, Bob, for the question. Well, we're very balanced. Here we are, balanced audience here tonight. You know, the balance and bias is often in the eye of the beholder, and that's one of the things that the ABC has to wrestle with is that it wants its presenters to be able to really choose their own people and all the rest. There can't be word coming down from on high as to who goes on what programs or whatever. So individuals do their best, and I know Tony does. But the fact of the matter is that there aren't any... I'm not trying to take your job, by the way, Tony. There aren't any right-wing or conservative presenters...
I'm not feeling terribly threatened, I must say.
I'll give you that. Good. There aren't any recognised conservative presenters on the ABC of major shows, so you can draw your own conclusions from that. But equally, they would argue that they're not left-wing either. And
as I said, Tom Switzer, Amanda Vanstone, they're
on the major programmes. Yeah,
on the major programmes. Yeah. So, but by the same token, where's your evidence the ABC is biased in any way?
I'm not saying the ABC is biased. I said it's in the eye of the beholder, and it really comes down to. If you see arguments being put, it's how an argument is put, is the discussion that takes place. You can determine after that whether there's been a fair or accurate looking at all the different points of view. Clearly, you believe that your view, you present that in Q&A. Lots of people disagree. I'm always delighted to be on the program because I believe you do.
Catherine.
Look, I think that it is an important issue, but I think the ABC's got more scrutiny on it than certainly any other media outlet in the country in relation to bias. And you look at during an election campaign, for example, even in my own local media, the local ABC, they have to count every single second that they've had someone from Labor on, someone from Liberal, someone from the Greens on. It's a huge amount of scrutiny on the ABC. I think it does a fantastic job, and I think it's disappointing that we're seeing such huge cuts to it. They're going to put it under pressure.
Now, Stuart, bringing in on another subject that's out of your portfolio. But what do you think?
The ABC, well, Malcolm Turnbull's office, of course, is right across from mine. I spent a lot of time with him. The wider question is, do we have a free, open press that's able to present their views without fear or favour? And the answer is yes. Do we always like the views that the media put forward? No, but we don't have to like it, nor does any other Australian. But it needs to be free. And I think we're very lucky to have a free press. Australian people will vote with their feet, as they always do. If they wish to read a newspaper or wish to watch a television, if they don't like what they see, exercise your civil right and turn it off. If you don't like what you read, close the book. If you don't like what you hear, put some music on. I have no problem with the ABC. I have no problem with any news outlet. Their job is to be free and fair, and I think we're very lucky we've got that.
Geoffrey Robertson.
Free press, not after that
spare me, Geoffrey, spare me.
Section 35P, which both of you have just passed, is a law that is 10 years imprisonment for journalists who probe special intelligence operations, even if they go disastrously wrong, like the bugging of the Timor-Leste cabinet, like the bugging of the Indonesian wife's telephone, etc. That now is a serious offence, and Lachlan Murdoch was quite right the other day to condemn you, both of you, for passing it in a great stampede. So, of course we need the ABC. They may seem a little biased when there are Conservative governments in power because their job is to hold the government to account. Their job is to ask awkward questions, and that's their role. As long as we don't have the Tony Joneses replaced by the Barry Spurs or whatever of Australian society, as long as the programmes are balanced, that's important. But it is ultimately important to maintain that press freedom, and Section 35P does not do that, and you've just passed it into law, both lots.
Well, you went off-piste there somewhat, Geoffrey, I must say. But I'm going to go back to the person who did ask the awkward question, Bob. Listening to the answers here, I mean, do you have a sense yourself the ABC is biased? Well,
no. My sense is that the ABC is always portrayed as the small, poor underling, and there's this big press out there, which is the private media. I'm simply saying I think the ABC is the largest media organisation out there. Therefore, the need for you to be balanced is crucial. That's what I'm saying.
Rowan, you probably wouldn't deny that.
No. To Catherine's point about excessive scrutiny on the ABC, of course there's excessive scrutiny on the ABC because it's your money, it's the public broadcaster, and it's your money being spent. And if your views aren't being reflected, then you're being duddled out of your money. That's why there is scrutiny on the ABC, and there always will be, rightly so. Totally with Geoffrey on 35P, that's an abomination, as the Spectator says.
OK, I'm afraid we'll
Agreed.
Your book again.
on a night of unusual equanimity, we'll leave the last word with the Spectator Australia. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Stuart Robert, Geoffrey Robertson, Rowan Dean and Catherine King. Thank you. Now, as we've heard, the government's security legislation is being debated in Parliament this week, and next Monday we'll broadcast a special edition of Q&A with the Attorney-General George Brandis, live from Bankstown in Western Sydney. We'll also be joined by leading Australian imams, senior police and legal experts. Senator Brandis will be facing questions from the community, which was home to Islamic State recruits and the focus of Australia's largest ever counter-terrorism raids. The Prime Minister says we need to shift the balance between freedom and security to fight the threat of terrorism. So join Q&A next Monday for your chance to question the Attorney-General on whether we're getting that balance right. Until then, good night.